It's now my honor and pleasure to introduce Gleaves Whitney, the director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, and I must say that the partnership that is developed between the Hauenstein Center and the Ford Museum has been wonderful, fabulous. The staffs work well together. We bring in all these programs, we co-sponsor. It's just a marvelous partnership that I hope continues for many, many years. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Gleaves.
Well, thanks very much, partner. It is a pleasure always to work with Jim Pratzis. And I also, while I'm mentioning a name here, I want to acknowledge the presence of the man who makes the Hauenstein part of the equation possible. Colonel Ralph Hauenstein is in the front row here. So as director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, I am very pleased to acknowledge this very important partnership. And the partnership that brought together this particular program was the Hauenstein Center with the Ford Foundation Library Museum with the Women's Center at Grand Valley State University. So I also want to acknowledge them as well this evening. Well, it's my high honor this evening to introduce a delightful person, this evening's speaker, who hails from New York City, which may be the place that will produce 3 presidential candidates in 2008. We don't know. Jill Norgren is Professor Emerita of Government at John Jay College at the City University of New York. Dr. Norgren received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and then her PhD from the University of Michigan. She was in Ann Arbor for 4 years, and so coming back to Michigan is a bit of a homecoming for her. Dr. Norgren has shown herself to be exceedingly accessible. When she came in yesterday, she immediately was in the classroom at Grand Valley. Students today were regaled by her stories and her expertise. And my staff, I can tell you, and I think the Ford staff as well, are turned on to have her in town because she is such an accessible scholar and teacher. So it's no wonder that she has had a very distinguished teaching career. And she's taught American politics, law, women, and the law. And enriching her teaching is her path-breaking scholarship that one can find in numerous professional journals and in 4 books that she has authored. Now, the book she's going to be talking about tonight, Belva Lockwood, the Woman Who Would Be President, recently published, has a fascinating story in and of itself. She discovered this book she discovered her subject, Belva Lockwood, in a children's book in a public library. And her interest grew from there, and I'll let her tell the story. It's absolutely fascinating. I also want to point out that as a researcher, Dr. Norgren describes herself as somewhat of an Agatha Christie. If you look at her resume, you see that she's almost as famous as the detective writer, the novelist. Her research has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the American Bar Association, just to name a few. And of course, she'll be speaking tonight about a very pioneering woman, an American attorney and presidential candidate to boot. And it's worth noting that her Belva Lockwood biography was written with the support of some very impressive organizations: the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian, the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. In fact, she is the first member of the John Jay College faculty to be awarded a Woodrow Wilson International Center Fellows Award. On a personal level, Jill told us that she has 2 children, appropriately for somebody who teaches women's history, both daughters, and 3 grandchildren, appropriately, since she teaches women's history, 3 granddaughters.
2 daughters.
And we were regaled by some stories about them as well. And we are so happy that you have joined us this evening for this very special program. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jill Norgren.
We have to attend technology here, I'm told. So first I'm going to switch that one off. And then I'm going to turn on the one that was giving us trouble. And do we have too much feedback? What do you think? We all right? Okay. Well, we'll see how it goes, and we'll adjust as we need to. I'm not much on technology, which is why I do history. So I rely a great deal on my husband, who does do technology. Speaking of my daughters and granddaughters, let me thank my eldest granddaughter. I hadn't done PowerPoint before this book was published, and when I was asked to launch the book in Washington, D.C. In March at the Wilson Center with Justice Ginsburg introducing me, I thought I need to have images. And of course, we used to call this a slideshow, right? And it was a lot easier when I was a teacher and I had a simple carousel. And I had to learn how to do all of this on the computer, and I didn't know anything. And one winter day, I called Elena Rohner, my then 10-year-old granddaughter. I had been told that in an after-school program, they were teaching the 5th graders PowerPoint, and I said, "Help!" And she came over, and she made the slide. She was fooling around, and I had a little poster in my study, and she looked at it, and she said, "I'll teach you with this one. This is, this is what you do." So that is, think of that as Elena's slide, and it's now a very well-known slogan and poster in the area of women's studies. Okay, we don't have a clock here, so I'm going to take a second to take my watch off, and then you also help me by being my timekeeper. We thought tonight that what we try and do is that I would talk for about 30 or 35 minutes, and then we'll do a little Q&A, because I really am anxious to hear from you folks. We've had some great discussions in the different schools and dinners and things, and I'd really like that. So let me begin with a few formal comments, and then we'll move to some of these terrific images that I think will give you a fuller picture of what I want to explore tonight. Every day, newspaper headlines and TV reporters shout out the name of Hillary Clinton, a contender for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. In today's New York Times, I found 3 articles about her without even really looking. In 1999, you may recall, we heard the name of Elizabeth Dole, a presidential hopeful among Republican contenders. And earlier still, there were Geraldine Ferrara, who ran as the Democrats' vice presidential candidate in 1984, and Brooklyn, New York Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, who in 1972 campaigned in a number of Democratic presidential primaries. Belva Lockwood, born Belva Bennett, campaigned for the presidency a century before these women. Because she was a pioneering woman attorney who opened the federal bar to all qualified women lawyers and a presidential candidate, Lockwood became one of the most well-known women of her generation. Her prominence was such that women named their children after her, towns bore her name, and businesses used her picture to advertise their products. Male journalists in the late 19th century wrote about her with admiration. At the beginning of the 20th century, other pioneering women attorneys hung her photograph on their office walls. During World War II, a merchant marine ship was named the Belva Lockwood. As late as 1958, magazine and newspaper advertisements used her picture and her life story to encourage Americans to buy U.S. savings bonds. Despite this early fame, few of you know her name. A bit like Alice in Wonderland, she fell down the rabbit hole and temporarily lost her place in U.S. history. Tonight, I want to tell you this woman's story and talk about how she and many other women have been lost in the writing of U.S. history. I want to urge that the writing of American history be expanded to include the lives and accomplishments of these women, of these leaders. And I want to connect their stories, Lockwood's in particular, to contemporary events, of course, to the 2007-2008 race for the White House, and to the current composition of the U.S. Supreme Court.